Yo, welcome back to One More Mana. My name's Derik, and today we're getting into another deck tech. We're jumping right back into Kaldheim. Now, at time of recording, we're like 3/4-ish of the way through preview season, so we're rolling right along. But there is one card that got previewed, and it didn't matter what else came out. I knew what I wanted to brew. It shouldn't be any surprise. It is a beautiful card, and finally, a playable version of this character. It is Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider. Now, if you want any of the amazing cards in this set, if you're still trying to catch up on Commander Legends, or again, if you're just trying to get that Phyrexian version of Vorinclex, the showcase version, the regular version, all the versions, head on over to TCG Player. TCG Player is amazing. One of the things I always say is you can go ahead and shop through your LGS and find LGSs in your area with TCG Player. And if you use the affiliate link down in the description below, you can help support the channel as well. We really do appreciate all the help. But now jumping back into Vorinclex. Vorinclex is amazing. Vorinclex is awesome. And if you're familiar with OG Vorinclex, it's not something you probably hear too often. Now, OG Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger, it's a bit of a boogeyman. Yeah, it's not, people don't tend to like it played too much. Now, it is a card I tried for so long to find a fun way to use this card. And if you're not familiar with it, basically it doubles your mana and halves, quote unquote, your opponent's mana, so their lands don't untap during their next untap step. It's one of those things, I'm not somebody who likes to go out and say like a card's just not fun, because, you know, everybody has different versions of fun. I've never seen OG Vorinclex played in a game that made the game more fun, to be completely honest. Every time it comes out, everybody's got the same reaction. And, you know, maybe some people have it in their metas and stuff where it's a good time, but for me personally, I just couldn't find a deck I could put it in without feeling bad every time I played it. So I have one that just sits in a binder. It's never touched a deck. It hasn't touched a deck in years at this point. And this Vorinclex changes it. I could finally bring Vorinclex back into the home of one of my decks, because this is just such a fun version of this card. I love how thematically they kind of kept the same thing going on with the doubling and the halving. Let's get right into it though. Vorinclex Monstrous Raider is 4 and 2 green for a 6/6 Trample haste. So y'all already know I love it because it's got Trample and haste, so it's just going to come punch somebody right away. But obviously the other abilities are the most important, the most fun. Now with that first ability that's just doubling all your counters, it's essentially doubling season without the token portion on a creature, which is extremely powerful and kind of awesome. And that second portion is super interesting because it halves all your opponent's counters. So this can act to basically shut down opponents' Planeswalkers if they have -1 counter synergies, +1 counter synergies. It's going to screw a lot of stuff up for them. What I love about it though, it's only for very niche strategies that it interrupts. It's not going to shut everybody at the table down. It might just shut one deck down, but there's still plenty of ways for them to respond and get back in the game, which was the biggest problem with OG Vorinclex. Now, basically with the counters on your side, with the doubling of your counters, there's a few things, if anybody's played doubling season, that really jump out for this. It's going to be +1 counters, it's going to be Planeswalker loyalty, and it's going to be Infect, which I guess didn't apply to doubling season, but it applies to this, which is amazing. Now, when I personally put this deck together, it's probably going to be very, very Infect heavy, but I did want to not lean on Infect too much. I want y'all to be able to play the deck and still have friends. So I used Infect as a little just spice on top. I didn't go super heavy in that direction. Y'all also know I'm not the biggest fan of Planeswalkers, but this ability is so damn cool that I feel like we have to take some advantage of it. So I did put a decent amount of Planeswalkers in there. But the biggest thing we're going to be leaning on for this deck are +1 counters. I love +1 counter strategies. I think 2 or 3 of my decks actually lean on +1 counters. To me, it's super fun because you get these crazy engines going and you end up with massive creatures to punch people with, which is the end goal for most of my decks. So I really like that. And that's really how this deck is going to run. It's a mono green +1 counter deck that sparkles in a few other things that our commander benefits from to go ahead and honestly create a pretty explosive, awesome deck. So we'll start with the creatures though. With the creatures, lots of +1 counter synergies. That's basically all the creatures are here to do, with a couple finishers sprinkled in on top. A lot of what we want in these creatures though are enablers, are lower drop creatures that are going to put +1 counters on themselves or other creatures to get engines going. So stuff like Pollen Bright Druid, stuff like Rishkar, Gyre Sage, different things like that are phenomenal in this deck because we get them down early and late game through a number of effects. We might just be able to throw counters onto these to get things going. This is the type of deck where Hydras are going to be phenomenal, and I didn't go super Hydra heavy, mainly just because I've built so many Hydra decks already. but even just a few Hydra effects are great, and probably the best being Stonecoil Serpent in this deck, in that they can be early drops with +1 counters just to get that engine going, but late game you have this effect to get a massive creature, especially with your commander's ability, that can then punch people and take people out. I would say the best enabler, though, even though it's not quite as early of a drop, is going to be Forgotten Ancient, just because it piles +1 counters so fast and you can just move them to whatever creatures you want. It's just such a great, if anybody's ever played with a Forgotten Ancient, it gets out of control so fast, and the fact that you're getting to spread them to other creatures kind of hides the fact that it is completely broken in and of itself, which is an added benefit to it. Now, again, with these +1 counters, we want to get all the utility we normally want in a deck just within this category. So stuff like Fertilid, you can get your ramp instead of running a Wood Elves, run a Fertilid so you can get those +1 counter synergies going as well. And the best board wipe, so to speak, in the deck is going to be Bane of Progress for that same reason, because you can wipe all the artifacts and enchantments off the board and end up with just a giant creature that you can punch people with. And thanks to your commander, it might be double giant, which, yeah, this can be a finisher in this deck, which is kind of crazy, but we'll get more in it. You see plenty of finishers. We'll get more into those in the game winning step. A lot of what I just want to emphasize are these enablers. And the coolest thing about enablers in this deck is there's so many options. At this point, there have been so many, even just printed at common, so many +1 counter synergizing creatures, that if you have any pet ones, you can go ahead and throw them in. As long as it starts getting those counters thrown around, they're going to do just fine in the deck. Now with the enchantments, all the stuff that basically copies our commander's ability seems like a no-brainer in here. So stuff like Branching Evolution, Doubling Season, Primal Vigor, even a Hardened Scales, which doesn't double but just adds to it. These are really good effects in the deck, because if our commander does get killed a few times, we still want to have access to making these abilities broken, which they are. The negative, obviously, these are all super expensive, money-wise. So I would say they're not 100% necessary. If you can even just get one of these thrown in the deck, because we have access to it in the command zone, it's not as crucial to have these extra, redundant effects. They do make the deck definitely stronger, but if it's a budget concern, I honestly think the deck's going to run pretty decently without them, just because, again, it's sitting on our command zone. It's not necessary to have too many redundant effects. And the last enchantment I want to talk about is actually also a card that used to be super expensive, but thankfully not the case anymore, and that is Greater Good. Y'all notice I put this in a lot of decks, even when it's not huge power creatures, but in a deck like this where you have so many giant creatures and you're just throwing +1 counters, it's a no-brainer. Again, the greatest thing about this card is it is that instant speed sack outlet. So if you spend all your time and energy making this giant, massive, scary creature to punch someone with, and someone tries to steal it, you do have that sack outlet as a backup plan as well. It is a card that, again, I think it reads worse than it is. If you haven't played with it, play it, and then after you haven't played a few times, you realize, wow, like this is the most broken card in every deck it's in. It's definitely a no-brainer in here. And especially with our commander and the different abilities we have to spread the +1 counters, we don't necessarily just have one big creature, so it doesn't hurt as much to sack one of them to get that card advantage. Now with the artifacts, the Ozolith is so good in this deck. It's so good because we have so many, again, low drop creatures that if we can get the Ozolith out early, we just have a bunch of +1 counter creatures. If they all die, just stack those up, then all of a sudden we can just throw them onto one big creature. Or if we get a big creature that dies, then we have a place to save the counters. The Ozolith is just an all-star in this deck. I also really love Sword of Truth and Justice, and I was super sad to see how expensive this card's gotten. But if you do happen to have one from when it wasn't quite as expensive, or if you played a lot of a lot of Modern Horizons, it's a really good card in this deck. The protection's great because it kind of can serve as evasion, and obviously, again, we're trying to spread those +1 counters everywhere, being able to proliferate, or if they have infect counters, it does everything you want. Now, the last card I'm going to point out, did not know it was this expensive when I built this deck. The Great Henge. What happened to the Great Henge? It says, maybe the computer's wrong. It says $50 for the Great Henge. I don't know how. I mean, it's really strong. It's amazing. It's great in this deck. You're going to pay 2 mana to ramp, draw cards, gain life, cook your breakfast. I always say it's going to do your taxes. It's going to take your kids to school. It's going to feed your cat. It's going to put band-aids on the wounds from your cat because you didn't feed your cat on time. It's going to do everything for you. But why is it $50? Yeah, I'm not sure when that happened, but hopefully you got one when it wasn't. I'm sorry, I'm real time seeing this and it just, why? Now with the sorceries, really the most important ones that, as in most of the decks that I like to build with giant creatures, are going to be your Rishkar's Expertises and Life Legacies and big card draw, big explosive card draw effects in this deck. Because we want a lot of cards in hand so that when we play these massive threats, if they're killed, we want to keep bringing threats out. Now, in this deck specifically, I did put 2 of the modal dual face cards I haven't got a chance to play too much with yet. Balagad Recovery's a 0, like a no-brainer. That's just every green deck can use that. And then I also have the giant mythic scary one that I don't really know how good it synergizes, but it's also a land, so like what's the downside? And that's kind of how I feel about most of these cards, is I find myself just throwing them in decks because there's no downside at all to playing them. So those are kind of like test spots, and seeing so far my experience with the modal dual face cards is I thought they were going to be great. They're even better. They are just phenomenal. They're so good, and I haven't played any of the mythic ones yet, but I think this is a decent deck for it because we have a chance to fetch some creatures with it on top of just being an untapped land. 2 really cool cards in the deck are going to be Vastwood Surge and Verdant Confluence because they fit multiple categories. Now, I realize these are kind of high on the CMC scale to be ramping. We typically, in most decks, you want to ramp turn 1, 2, maybe 3. So to be this high on the mana curve to be ramping you seems kind of strange, but they do synergize super well with the +1 counters as well. And this is not the type of deck where you're trying to race out and kill people fast. It's pretty casual, just fun, ramp, play big things, punch people type deck. So you have less pressure to worry about all your ramp being 1 or 2 CMC. You have a lot of leeway to just play fun cards, and I do think these fit in that slot. And with Bane of Progress, I mentioned board wipes that synergize. Azuri's Predation does an amazing job of this as well, because this is a very creature-based punching people type deck. So to have a board wipe that can just fill your board with creatures, and through other effects being able to potentially place +1 counters on those creatures, insane. I mean, you're mono green, so you don't really have many options. You're probably playing Azuri's Predation anyway, but especially in a deck like this where you're trying to punch people, it is amazing. I mean, mono green, you're always trying to punch people. Either way, it's really good. And I think more so than other decks, because I know there's the Great Aurora, and maybe some people run O-Stone, different things like that. I think more so than even other decks, Azuri's Predation should really go into this one. Now, in the instance, we have a lot of removal answers, obviously, just instant speed shenanigans we're trying to pull off. I really do love Inspiring Call, just because it's going to be protection. It's like a weird version of essentially a heroic intervention for you with the benefit of drawing cards. And again, like I said, we're trying to spread those +1 counters out a lot of the time, and then have a turn where we're able to move them around or do something to where we get that one big creature. So this can draw you potentially a lot of cards. With the added protection is great. I also love Invigorating Surge. Again, if we're trying to spread counters around a little bit to start and you leave one unblocked, at instant speed you can play this, and with your commander, it's basically multiplying the number of +1 counters times 4. That can kill somebody out of nowhere. And this is, again, combat tricks aren't always great in commander, but in this deck you can do some work. I would even consider throwing other ones in, especially again because in this instant speed slot we have crazy card draw to make up for the card disadvantage of those combat tricks. So again, we're going to have stuff in this slot like Return of the Wild Speaker and Momentous Fall, so that way we do have the ability to play a lot of these attacky type things and then just refill our hand if we need to afterwards. Now with the Planeswalkers, we're basically just I picked my favorite green Planeswalkers and Eugene. It's the green Planeswalkers and Eugene. I love Garruk. I just love Garruk as a character. Garruk's super cool. So I just threw all the Garruks I could find in here. I think I picked 4 I ended up going with. Eugene's obviously in there, picked a couple Nissas, just different things like that, just kind of your favorites. I basically, when I went through, none of the alts are immediately game ending. I would say maybe one of the Garruks and Eugene are the closest to just ending the game, but there's nothing that just ends the game on the spot in here. So you are able to play these alt and try to do something crazy, but your opponents are still going to be able to answer for it, which is kind of the space I wanted to be in. To really just, they're powerful effects, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing that's just done. So I think that's pretty fun. And even without your commander out, these are still all just very powerful Planeswalkers in and of themselves that synergize well with the deck, and that's kind of where I wanted to be at with it. I'll see how it goes. Again, I don't have much love for Planeswalkers most of the time, but if they end up being super fun in the deck, I will kind of expand this category and go beyond the 8 that I threw in to start. Now with the lands, it really doesn't matter much outside of basics. I mean, we are mono green, so you can kind of just throw whatever you want in there. I am excited to get to try out War Room. Don't know how good it's actually going to be in practice, because that's a lot of mana to tap to draw 1 card, but I'll test it in there. It's a monocolored deck, it doesn't hurt us. Rogue's Passage is super necessary in the deck because, again, we're going to have a lot of big creatures. Just tons of evasion / trample in the deck, but this is a way to get around it if we need to. And Cardin's Bastion is a super powerful card because it's going to allow us to proliferate. And again, as we spread those +1 counters, just keep proliferating, throwing things on top, and just ending up with a massive, scary army. But that's going to do it for all the categories. Now let's move on to the best part of every deck tech. And in this deck, the stompiest part, and that's the game-winning step. How are we about to win the game with this deck? So the first way to win the game is going to be Trample. It's basically in one word. Every way that we're trying to win the game with this deck, this whole entire deck, the whole point is you end up with creatures and then more and more +1 counters over time, and just, yeah, you have a massive army of giant things. And really the various ways to win are going to be, how do we turn that into damage? So yeah, that first way is going to be Trample. Probably the most fun ways to do that are with the +1 counter Trample enablers. So stuff like Tuskguard Captain, Gnarlid Colony, these different type of effects can just make it scary. We can hold these in hand, get a big board full of creatures with all these +1 counters. People might think they have chump blockers, and we could block this and just trample on through. We have plenty of ways to give trample. Some of our Deriks can do things when there's all types of different things going on where trample is going to come through. And that's probably the most like vanilla-ish way to win, but it might be the most consistent for you in the deck. Now, I would say the second way to win is actually going to be through the various Planeswalker alts. And I said none of them on the spot, just end the game technically. But if you get a situation where your commander's out, you can play a Planeswalker or maybe two and ult them both in a turn and start stacking these emblems, stuff is going to get silly for you fast. And I do really like that. The thing I don't like about Super Friends decks is the non-stop upticking, downticking, upticking, downticking. With this deck, you basically want to play your Planeswalkers to play ult, go. And the emblems are going to stack. It'll get a little confusing like that, but I do think getting these emblems out, again, will enable you enough to win the game, especially if there's multiple. And that's going to be another pretty consistent way. You always have access to your commander, and if you sequence it right, you should be able to consistently get these emblems out. And again, with our stoppy creatures in combination, it's going to allow you to punch through that damage. And now for the third way to win the game. It should be zero surprise to anyone. We are taking our weekly trip to Phyrexia. And now there's kind of two categories. I don't have a ton of Infect in here like I mentioned, but there's a few Infect cards. Two can be kind of out of nowhere, and that would be Grafted Exoskeleton and Triumph of the Hordes. Now, everybody already knows about Triumph of the Hordes. I'm assuming the Boogeyman, give everything +1/+1 Infect and Trample. This just ends games everywhere forever. So that's not a surprise of it being able to just be an out of nowhere kill. But where Grafted Exoskeleton comes into play is because your commander is a 6/6 Trample and you really only need to deal 5 Infect with its ability, this becomes very scary because you can just immediately play out your commander, attack. If they don't have enough blockers, they're just dead. These are very powerful effects, obviously, but this deck should be functioning, at least the way I built it. It shouldn't be super fast. It should be somewhat slow moving and kind of just building up over time, so that when you do have that turn where you kind of kill someone out of nowhere, it shouldn't be till turn 8, 9, or 10. Even when you have that explosive out of nowhere win, it's not going to be super early on in the game. So I think that's okay. It's also important to have these effects because if you're playing against a lot of life gain or like control-y decks, or you're just in a situation where the game's just running on too long, these might be welcomed effects by the time you get to like hour 3 of a game. So I feel like, especially for a slower moving deck, these are necessary. But something that is not out of nowhere and is not subtle in any way, and that's why I love it so much, is Blightsteel Colossus. Blightsteel Colossus is already in most situations a one-hit kill. I don't really have any haste enablers. I didn't really go into equipments and trying to, again, I didn't want to be that sneaky with it. This is the type of deck where you just want to drop a Blightsteel, give everyone one cycle of the table, see what happens. If they don't do anything about it, someone is dead. And your commander is going to make extra sure of that, because 11/11 Trample Infect is already enough. But when you only have to get 5 of that through, yeah, that's a lot. And we could throw more +1 counters on it. We could end up with like a 30/30 Infector just because we want to. Blightsteel is amazing. All of these Infect effects are super fun in the deck. And again, where the deck's power level is, I do think it needs that little extra kick so you can make sure you can take people out, because otherwise you might end up dirtling a little bit. But yes, I love these so much. If I had to pick one, so let's say you're not as in love with Infect as I am and you kind of just want to get a little taste of it, I would recommend probably going with the Grafted Exoskeleton first. Triumph of the Hordes is very explosive and some playgroups get really salty about it, and Blightsteel's a little bit more expensive and is just a very big scary card, so it might get a reaction. The Grafted Exoskeleton is a cool little intro to the Infect, so you just get a little drop of that Phyrexian oil before you get completed and wanted everything else. So I would say if you only wanted to pick one, use that as a starting point, and it'll just go in with the other synergies of the deck just fine. And that is going to do it for this week's Deck Tech. I really hope y'all enjoyed it. I'm so happy we have a new Vorinclex and one that I can play without feeling bad. I think we'll find out. We'll see how mean it is in practice, but I'm very, very excited about it. I hope y'all are too. I would be curious to see if other Praetors end up coming back through various planes. I'm really bad at remembering story things, so I forgot how many are dead, but hopefully they come back whether they're zombified or not. I'm very excited to see that, and I'm excited for Kaldheim. Let me know down in the comments what y'all's favorite commanders are. There's gonna be plenty of deck techs to come, so hopefully I get a chance to tackle most of those. As always, a huge shout out to all the patrons. We love and appreciate y'all so so much, and there's so many exciting things to come. We're starting some new series and stuff. I don't think I'm allowed to say that. We'll find out. Well, spoiler alert, but yeah, there's some very new spicy things to come. And as always, said something that's not new, go ahead and check out our gameplay videos. Every Saturday night we're streaming on Twitch, so if you can come hang out with us live, that would be amazing. We always appreciate it. But if not, we do post those videos during the week, so check it out. You get to see the petty in practice, which is always so much fun. But yes, tons and tons of things to come, tons of Kaldheim to come. But until then, I will see y'all next time.